Shepnaz Podcast begins now.
Welcome to the Shepnaz Podcast. I'm Joe, and I'm your host today, and we are continuing our conversation from yesterday. We're diving a little deeper into Pastor Rob's message from this past Sunday. We've been looking at the acronym of BLESS, which is begin with prayer, listen, eat, serve, and we're on the last letter today, which is the last S, and that's sharing our story. So welcome in, Pastor Rob.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not sure whether the letter S stands for sharing or story.
It's either one.
Because if you use three S's, it would be two. You would spell the word wrong, and that wouldn't count.
Yeah.
So
well, either one you want to use.
Yeah, I think story.
Okay, we'll go with the story.
Because that's the most important part. Yeah. Yeah, so we're wrapping this up, coming to the last letter in the acronym, and it's the letter S, and it's talking about our story. And so what happens is we've been praying for our neighbors, we've been listening to them, hearing what their needs are, what's going on in their life, what God is doing, where they are. We've shared meals with them where we've had the opportunity to eat even, to share even more, listen even more, and then we've served them. We've seen needs in their life. And then the last letter is the letter S, and it's sharing your story when the time is right. So it doesn't mean that, once you've done all those things, you have to all right, now the time you got to hear my testimony, or you got to hear the 4 spiritual laws or whatever. And I would also say, while we're on this, you don't have to do these in order, obviously. None of these require an order. You can do it at any time. But there will come a time when you're doing this and building a relationship with somebody that they might say, why are you like you are? Or what's different about you? Or why are you doing these things? Or I noticed this about you. What is it? And obviously for us, it would be the fact that we have a relationship with God and He's made a difference in our life. And St. Francis of Assisi is credited with saying this, and you probably have heard it before: preach the gospel at all times, if necessary, use words. Yeah. And the idea is that we're a good example and people can see Jesus in the way that we live. Well, that's really what's happening in all those other letters, right? And all that. But I also would just like to say that at some point it will be necessary to use words. Yeah. At some point we have to be able to say, this is why I am the way I am. Peter says in 1 Peter 3:15, he says, in your heart set apart Christ as Lord, and always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect. And so we always need to be ready to share why we have this hope. And it's interesting that in the church over time, and I had a little bit of fun with this on Sunday, putting up all these different methods that we use of evangelism. And over the years, this was just a small smattering. There's a lot of them.
When I saw those images, it brought back a lot of memories. Yeah. In fact, I almost had PTSD over some of them.
Yeah, they're just a lot of ways. And honestly, they're good because they're tools and resources that help us to share the gospel. Some of the things I talked about with evangelism explosion, the 4 spiritual laws, servant evangelism, the Romans Road, the ABCs of the gospel, the bridge. When I was a youth pastor, we made these wordless books and we took them on mission trips, or when we make beads, and then there's soccer balls with the colors on it and all that other kind of stuff. And they're all good. They're the tools.
Wordless book.
Yes. Yeah. They're tools that help us to share the gospel. But what happens is a lot of times is that we don't want to share. We're kind of afraid to share the gospel. We have, you get kind of anxious or whatever. I talked about a couple of excuses that we have for not sharing the gospel. One of them is I don't have all the right answers. If I start talking to somebody about my faith and they ask a question that I don't know the answer to, it's gonna, I'm gonna look stupid or whatever. And I would just say that I don't know all the right answers. No one knows all of the right answers except for Jesus Himself. And you probably won't have all the right answers. But I think the fact that you might not have all the right answers could be comforting to a person when they maybe ask you a question. You're like, I'm not sure about that. Let me look it up, or let me think. I had a professor in college who always said, you can ask me anything. If I don't know it, I'll figure it out for you. And that's what you say to your friend, I don't know the answer to that, but I'll figure it out. And then it gives you an opportunity to grow, and then another opportunity to go back and have a conversation with them.
When we recently heard John Maxwell talk, he kind of addressed that issue where he was saying that if he didn't have an answer, he'd say, can I check that out and get back with you? And he said, I was using that as an opportunity then to set up the next time that I was going to talk to him.
Yeah.
And, we were kind of tongue-in-cheek about those different tools and everything. And that's not to knock that,
Right.
sometimes people use those tools and use them very effectively.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that you have to have those. I
Right.
know for me personally, I don't particularly use this method now. I think I've maybe matured into a more organic method, but
Yeah.
I used to have a particular Bible that I had marked the scripture references, and I had it going to page this, page that, or
Yeah.
whatever that would walk me through it. And all of the references were written upside down in the top margin of
Yep.
the pages so that
Yeah.
I could be on the other side of the Bible and they could be looking at it and I could be reading what page I need to go to next.
Yep. I have a Bible that has those in it as well. Yeah.
But I mean, you're right. Ultimately, we come to this time when we have to actually say what it is and say what I think it's what 1 Peter is it 3:15? Yes. Says that we have to be ready at all times to be able to share the hope that's within us.
Yeah.
And so we got to get ready.
Yeah. Well, and I think, I talked Sunday about the blind man. I don't know if you remember the blind man, the man that was born blind, and Jesus healed him, and the religious leaders pressed him like, what happened to you? And at the end of the day, he says, I don't know what happened, but here's what I do know. I was blind and now I see.
Yeah.
And, you don't have to have all the right answers to theology and apologetics and all that other kind of stuff. And we'll talk about this in a minute. Your story is what matters.
Yeah.
Because you can't refute that. I don't know it all. I don't know how it all happened systematically, but I know this is what my life was like and this is what it's like now. And so that's the thing. So yeah, I don't have all the right answers, bad excuse, because people don't expect you to have all the right answers. Another one is I don't want to impose my beliefs on my friends and my family. And I would say, in answer to that I hope that that we're not trying to ask you to beat people over the head with your Bible or try to beat theology into their heads. We're not asking that. We're not asking anybody to preach at their neighbors or friends or relatives with a level of arrogance or anger or vindictiveness. What we're really doing is just sharing the gospel, right? Sharing the difference that Jesus has made in our life. Two things about that. One, Romans chapter 10, verse 14 says this, how can they call on Jesus to save them unless they believe in him? And how can they believe in him if they have never heard about him? And how can they hear about him unless someone tells them? And so at the end of the day, somebody has to tell them or they're never going to know. They're never going to have the opportunity to know that Jesus can make a difference in their life. And there's a missiologist, and I've heard this before, who says, what evangelism is or what Christianity is really all about. It's not about beating people over the head. He said that Christianity is just one beggar telling another beggar where he found bread.
Yeah.
And we're all hungry for purpose and meaning in our life. And if you found that, people who are looking for that as well. They're hungry for that. And you can just say, look, I don't have the answer to how it all happened or whatever. I just know I found something that made a difference in my life, and it made a difference in my life, and it can probably make a difference in your life too. And let it be that, right? That's what it is. And so we're not trying to beat people into submission and make them like us or like you or like me or anybody, but we want them to know that I found something that changed my life, and I think it could change your life too. So
I think one of the convicting parts about this is that a lot of times for people to be looking for spiritual help, to be looking for answers, they have to see something different in your life to want to ask what's different in your life.
Yeah.
And if they don't see a difference, there's no reason that they would ask you.
Right.
And I kind of think of when you go to a restaurant, anytime I go to a Tex-Mex place or whatever, when something's walking by me, the fajita tray, that's still sizzling on the plate as they're serving it to the table next, all of a sudden that particular menu item becomes more appealing to me because as it was walking by, I was like, that smelled good. It sounded good.
You could hear it, see it, smell it.
This would be good at my table.
Yeah.
And there has to be something like that in my life where the people around me, and maybe it's through this process of praying and listening and then eating with them and serving them, to finally they're like, okay, so what is different with your life?
Yep, for sure, definitely. Well, the third excuse that we talked about Sunday was that sharing my story makes me feel uncomfortable, and I would just say, I think that's normal. I wouldn't say it's not normal. Excuse me. That, I when I'm talking to someone about my faith, I get nervous, I get anxious, and I think there's a lot of reasons to it, and I don't think it's bad that you might. I do, but it doesn't mean that I should let my feelings override my burden or my care or my desire for them to come to know the Lord, right? Excuse me. And so if I have something that has the potential to change the trajectory of someone's life or their family history, even for generations, and I would choose not to say something to them because I don't want to feel uncomfortable, I don't like how that makes me feel, that's a pretty selfish thing for me to have. And so I think there's no answer to this other than do it anyway. I mean, when Jesus was on the cross, that was probably pretty uncomfortable for him. So,
well, and I think that we sometimes kind of buy the lie that we're going to have to get into these long theological discussions. And I think sometimes that's even coming from the enemy to try to discourage us from having these conversations, because I look back at my own personal experience, and the most convicting thing in my life that brought me to a point of decision personally was not a long theological discussion. It was my dad looking over at me one Sunday morning and said, you'll have to make this decision someday for yourself. Yeah. That was it. That was like, because I had already been exposed to other things, and that rattled around in my head for a couple months, to the point where there was a service later that I made a decision because that one question was asked.
Yep.
And just as recently as this past week, I was sharing with someone, and it was a couple weeks ago, and instead of getting into a long discussion, it was, you need to do this. When are you going to do it? And they're like, I need to do it now.
Yeah.
and that was the whole,
yeah. Who got baptized on Sunday.
Right. That was the whole discussion.
Yeah.
I mean, there was obviously a lot of things that led up to that. But as you're sharing here, like, all those other things had happened over a course of time, of the praying about it, of the listening, of eating together and serving, all that stuff. If I look back over our relationship, I know all those things happened. I wasn't sitting there saying, okay, now I'm on the B, now I'm on the L.
Right.
But I can definitely identify all of those elements were there.
Yeah.
And then it came to the point of, all right, so what now?
Yep.
And he was ready.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And the Lord's doing a really cool thing in his life.
And the neat thing about it is, it wasn't me doing anything. It was just realizing God was already working in his life, and for me to see that, and then to just prompt him by saying, are you going to do it or not?
Yeah.
And that was enough, because God had already been working on his heart.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really cool. Yeah. So even though it's uncomfortable, it's just, we still have to do it. And last thing before we wrap this up is, the last thing that I said was, you don't need to have a great presentation. You just need to share your story. I'm going to cough again. Sorry.
That's been a rough one. And I didn't bring the water this time.
Man. So the Lord's telling me I'm talking too much. So there's 3 things about your story that I think are really important. Number 1 is, what was your life like before you came to know Jesus? Second one is, how did you come to know Jesus? And the third one is, how's your life different? And that's it. I mean, all you got to do is say, look, before I came to know Jesus, this is what my life was like, and this is how I came to know him, however it was, and it's going to be different for everybody. And then, how's my life different? And then when we do that, sorry for those of you who are listening, when we do that, then we've shared our story. It's not It's not the 4 spiritual laws. It's not the ABCs of the gospel. It's not the Romans road. It's like, this is what happened to me. This morning during our prayer time, Pastor Kevin shared that the Lord was speaking to him from 1 John, and I just want to read you a couple verses here. Because John, who was the disciple, wrote this letter called 1 John to the churches, and this is what he did. He says, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, that which was from the beginning he's talking about is Jesus. So he said Jesus was from the beginning. He says, that which we've heard, which we've seen with our eyes, which we've looked at and our hands have touched, this is what we proclaim concerning the word of life. And so then he goes on and he writes to you about everything that he has seen and heard and touched and felt with Jesus. He literally just shared his story. And people read his story, they hear the gospel. They see the difference that Jesus made in his life. And that's exactly what we would do, right? This is what my life was like before I came to know Jesus. And you might have came to know Jesus early in your life. And so you don't have like this gutter to God testimony. That's okay. The Lord kept you from those things. But what was your life like? How did you come to know him? Maybe it was VBS. Maybe it was a friend who shared the gospel with you. Maybe it was your parent. Maybe you heard it at a church, whatever. This is how I came to know. But now my life is different. And this outline parallels the story of the blind man, right? Who Jesus said, this guy was blind. He couldn't see. This is what his life was like before Jesus. He came to know Jesus. He's like, really, his story is not really cool. And Jesus spit in the mud and put mud on his eyes, said, go wash in the pool. And he goes, I did. And then how's my life different? I can see now.
Right.
I mean, that's a powerful testimony. It's been in the Bible for centuries. We read about it and we listen to it. And it's just the blind man's story. It's like, I couldn't see. I met Jesus. He did some weird stuff to me. And now I can see. That's my story.
Right, and there was no way for them to deny it because he could see, and so in the same way in our stories, when we can speak about how God has changed us, how God has carried us through times, they can't deny it because you've already lived it. Yeah. And this makes me think so many times when there have been people that have wanted to engage in kind of apologetic conversations about the existence of God and everything else. Yeah. And I'm like, there's nothing you can say that's going to discourage me from this because I know him like I know you. Yeah. So I know this person, whether you've met him or not is irrelevant to this discussion. Right. I know him and I've experienced this relationship. Yeah. So there's nothing you can do that's going to refute that. Yeah. Yep. Well, that's the thing. That's, so how do we win our neighbors? How do we make a difference? Is we pray for them, we listen to them, we share our life with them through meals, we serve them when we can, and we use our words and share our story. And that is what Jesus did when he was here. Yeah. And that's the same thing that we can do. This is all written in a book called Bless, ironically, Bless. Hey, imagine that. We have some available at the church. You can also get it on Amazon or whatever. It's just called Bless. And it's by Dave Ferguson and John Ferguson. And you didn't know that I want to do this, but I'd like to do a whole nother podcast on, there's a Bless app. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to do a whole nother podcast on that at some point soon. Because this app that we use, you can get the app, you can identify with our church, and then you can put in your address, and the app helps you identify the neighbors that live around you, and it sends you a prayer prompt for 5 of your neighbors every day, and you just keep praying for them. So you start praying for your neighbors, even the ones you maybe don't even know yet. And as you're praying for them, the Lord starts working in their life and in your life. And we track those kinds of things. We'll talk more about it. We did talk a little bit about it on Sunday, but I'd like to do a whole nother episode on that at some point. So we'll do that. So, well, we'll definitely get that one in the hopper. In the meantime, we'll go ahead and include a link in the description of this episode for the Bless app so that if you want to download it and kind of play around with it, and then when we do an episode about it, we can kind of dive deep into it. You can be looking at it as we're talking about it.
Yeah. In the book, maybe we'll put a link for the book.
For the book as well.
With the author,
so when you get done with all that, in the meantime, you can go to shepnaz.org and check out everything that's going on at the church and all the resources there on the Shep Now page. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. For Pastor Rob, I'm Joe. Have a great day. This podcast is a production of the Shepherd Church of the Nazarene, Gahanna, Ohio. email to podcast@shepnaz.org and let us know what you think.